Nobody in the meteorological community wants to say the words out loud because saying them out loud means admitting that one of the most sophisticated atmospheric forecasting systems ever built by human beings, decades of satellite technology, hurricane hunter aircraft, supercomputer modeling infrastructure that processes billions of data points per hour, and generations of accumulated scientific knowledge about how tropical systems behave, did not see this coming with the clarity and the confidence that the public deserves when a major hurricane is bearing down on a populated coastline. But the data does not care about professional comfort, and the latest advisory from the National Hurricane Center does not leave any room for softening the message. The storm did something that the models did not predict, something that the forecast guidance did not capture, something that has happened before in the historical record, but rarely with this speed, this completeness, and this catastrophic timing relative to landfall. This storm fell apart, and then it came back. It weakened dramatically, dropping in intensity fast enough that forecasters were cautiously, carefully beginning to revise their impact projections downward, beginning to communicate to the public that the worst-case scenario was becoming less likely, beginning to allow themselves the professional relief that comes when a dangerous storm shows signs of losing its punch before it reaches land. And then, in the span of hours that felt to the forecasters watching it like a slow-motion disaster unfolding on their screens, it re-intensified. Not gradually, not incrementally. It came back with a fury that has the National Hurricane Center now issuing language in their forecast discussions that is as alarming as anything they have published about this storm since it first developed. The communities that exhaled when this storm weakened need to understand right now, with total clarity, that the exhale was premature. The storm is back. It is angry, and it is closer than it was when it started falling apart. Let me take you through exactly what happened, because the sequence of events over the last 36 hours is one of the most meteorologically significant and operationally dangerous storm behavior patterns that forecasters encounter in the Atlantic Basin, and understanding the mechanism is not an academic exercise. It is the foundation of understanding why the threat right now is, in some specific and critical ways, worse than it would have been if the storm had simply maintained its intensity throughout. The weakening began when this storm encountered a combination of atmospheric factors that forecasters had been monitoring as potential inhibitors. A pocket of slightly drier air on the storm's western flank, a modest but real increase in wind shear associated with an upper-level trough passing to the north, and the natural disruption of an eye wall replacement cycle that temporarily disorganized the storm's inner core. These are not unusual factors. They are the kinds of atmospheric interference that weaken tropical systems regularly, and when they appeared in the observational data, the forecast models responded by projecting a sustained weakening trend that would carry the storm to landfall at a significantly reduced intensity compared to its peak. That projected weakening trend was communicated publicly. It was incorporated into the forecast advisories, and it was received by millions of people in the threat corridor in exactly the way that any honest meteorologist would have feared, as permission to relax. The re-intensification began before the inhibiting factors had finished their work, and that timing is the detail that makes this storm's behavior so operationally dangerous. Normally, when a tropical system encounters the kind of atmospheric interference this storm experienced, the weakening process runs its course over 24 to 36 hours before the storm either stabilizes at a lower intensity or begins to slowly recover. What the storm did instead was begin recovering while the inhibiting factors were still present, a behavior that the post-event analysis will likely attribute to the extraordinary ocean heat content along the storm's path, providing a fuel supply so rich and so deep that it overwhelmed the weakening mechanisms before they could complete their work. The warm water beneath this storm is not just anomalously warm at the surface. The heat extends through a deep layer of the ocean column, deep enough that the wind-driven upwelling that normally brings cold water to the surface and starves a weakening storm of its fuel source was not bringing up water cold enough to interrupt the re-intensification. The ocean was handing this storm back its engine before the atmosphere had finished trying to shut it down. And the result is a storm that has now completed one of the most dramatic and most dangerous re-intensification sequences in recent Atlantic hurricane history. The specific intensity trajectory over the last 24 hours is what has forecasters using words in their internal discussions that do not often appear in professional meteorological discourse. The storm dropped significantly in maximum sustained winds during the weakening phase. Enough of a drop that intensity forecasts were being revised downward in official products, and the public messaging around the storm's impacts was beginning to shift toward a less catastrophic framing. And then, in the re-intensification phase, it recovered nearly all of that lost intensity, and in some of the latest reconnaissance data appears to be pushing beyond its previous peak. Let that sit with you for a moment. A storm that weakened enough to change the public forecast, change the official messaging, and change the mental preparation posture of millions of people in its path, has now re-intensified to levels at or above where it was before the weakening began. The communities that updated their internal risk calculus downward when the weakening trend was announced, the residents who decided the forecast had shifted in a favorable direction and began making decisions accordingly, are now sitting in front of a storm that is as dangerous as it ever was, with less time to prepare than they had when the weakening started, and with a psychological framework around this storm's threat that is currently calibrated to the wrong intensity level. The psychological dimension of what happened here is something I need to address directly because it is not a soft secondary concern. It is a hard, operational life safety issue that emergency managers are actively wrestling with right now as they try to recommunicate an escalating threat to a public that received de-escalating messaging less than 24 hours ago. Human beings process risk information through a framework that is heavily influenced by recent experience and recent messaging. When official sources communicate that a threat is decreasing, the public's risk perception decreases. When official sources then communicate that the same threat has re-escalated, the public response is not a clean, linear return to the previous level of concern. Research on risk communication consistently shows that re-escalation messages are processed with more skepticism, more fatigue, and less behavioral response than initial escalation messages. People who updated their plans based on the weakening trend are not equally willing to update them again based on the re-intensification trend. The re-escalation message feels like a reversal, and reversals erode the credibility of the warning system in the moment when that credibility is most critically needed. Emergency managers know this. The National Hurricane Center knows this. And it is why the language in the latest advisories is as direct and as urgent as it is. Because the forecasters issuing those advisories understand that they are not just communicating a new intensity number, they are communicating against the grain of a public that was just told the storm was getting weaker, and they are doing it with a shrinking timeline before landfall. The structural condition of this storm right now, the internal organization that the hurricane hunters are observing on their reconnaissance flights through the system, is in some ways more alarming than the raw intensity number alone suggests. A storm that has just completed a rapid re-intensification cycle after a period of disruption often emerges from that process in a more organized, more compact, more structurally efficient configuration than it had before the disruption occurred. The eye wall replacement cycle that contributed to the initial weakening, if it has completed successfully during the re-intensification phase, produces a new eye wall that is tighter, more symmetric, and more efficient at extracting energy from the ocean surface than the previous eye wall structure. The reconnaissance data coming in right now is showing exactly that pattern. A contracting eye, a warming eye temperature, a reorganizing eye wall with deepening convection that has the structural signatures of a storm in a robust intensification phase rather than a recovering one. This is not a storm that limped back from a weakening episode to its previous level. This is a storm that used the weakening and re-intensification cycle as a reset mechanism and has emerged from it structurally stronger in ways that the raw wind speed number does not fully capture. The intensity forecast from this point to landfall is the question that every forecaster working this storm is focused on right now, and the answer is not comforting. The environmental conditions between the storm's current position and the projected landfall point remain favorable for intensity maintenance, and in the most aggressive model scenarios for additional intensification. The sea surface temperatures along the remaining track are above normal. The wind shear is not increasing significantly. The atmospheric moisture content remains high. The storm has momentum, both literal forward momentum and the organizational momentum of a system that has just demonstrated its ability to overcome inhibiting factors and re-intensify aggressively. The baseline forecast carries the storm to landfall at or near its current re-intensified intensity. The high-end scenarios carry it to landfall stronger than it is right now. There is no scenario in the current guidance envelope where this storm arrives at the coastline in a significantly weakened state, because the environment between here and landfall does not contain the ingredients that would produce significant weakening. The ocean will not cool the storm. The atmosphere will not shear it apart. The dry air that contributed to the initial weakening has been processed through the circulation and is no longer a meaningful inhibiting factor. What you see on the current advisory is, at minimum, what is coming ashore. And what you see on the current advisory is a major hurricane. The storm surge threat, recalibrated to the re-intensified intensity, is the parameter that demands the most immediate attention from the communities in the threat corridor. Storm surge is a nonlinear function of hurricane intensity. It does not increase proportionally with wind speed. It increases disproportionately, meaning that the difference in surge between a storm at the weakened intensity that was being forecast yesterday and a storm at the re-intensified intensity being forecast today is larger than a simple wind speed comparison would suggest. The surge inundation models have been rerun with the updated intensity inputs and the values they are producing for the most vulnerable locations. in the threat corridor are higher than what was being communicated during the weakening phase. Communities that were told their surge exposure was in a certain range based on yesterday's forecast are now looking at updated surge values that, in some locations, are 2 to 4 feet higher than those previous projections. 2 to 4 additional feet of storm surge is not an incremental adjustment. In a coastal geography where land elevation above sea level is measured in single digits, 2 to 4 additional feet of water is the difference between a structure that survives with repairable damage and a structure that is destroyed. It is the difference between a surge zone that is dangerous and a surge zone that is unsurvivable. And it is arriving in communities whose preparation posture was calibrated to a forecast that no longer exists. I want to be specific about what the re-intensification means for the wind threat beyond the immediate landfall zone, because the wind field of a storm that has undergone a re-intensification cycle can behave differently from a storm that has maintained steady intensity throughout its life cycle. During the re-intensification phase, as the eye wall contracts and the inner core reorganizes, the wind field often undergoes a structural change that concentrates the highest winds in a tighter area around the center, while simultaneously expanding the broader wind field outward. The practical consequence of that structural change is a storm that produces more extreme winds in the eye wall zone and tropical storm force winds over a larger geographic area than the previous intensity-based forecast was showing. Communities at the outer margins of the wind field, communities that were on the edge of the tropical storm force wind threshold in yesterday's forecast, may now find themselves solidly inside that threshold in today's updated projections. The expanded wind field means more widespread power outages, more extensive tree damage, more road closures from downed trees and power lines, and a larger geographic footprint of impact that stretches the emergency response resources across a wider area during the critical first hours after landfall. The rainfall threat from this storm has also been recalibrated upward in the wake of the re-intensification, and the mechanism behind that recalibration matters for understanding the specific flooding risk in the days after landfall. A more intense, more organized storm with a tighter inner core and a more robust convective structure produces higher rainfall rates in the eye wall and inner rain bands than a weaker, less organized system. The total rainfall accumulation over any given location depends on both the rainfall rate, the storm's forward speed, and the track guidance for this. Storm shows a forward speed after landfall that is not particularly fast, meaning the storm will be delivering its elevated rainfall rates over interior communities for an extended period, rather than moving through quickly and limiting the total accumulation. The areas most at risk from catastrophic inland flooding are those that sit in the path of the storm's post-landfall track, where the combination of high rainfall rates and slow forward motion produces total accumulations that can exceed 20 inches in the most focused areas. 20 inches of rain delivered over 24 to 36 hours to a watershed that may already be running above. Normal represents a flash flooding and river flooding scenario that continues to produce life-threatening conditions long after the storm's winds have diminished to below hurricane force. There is a specific population that I am most worried about right now, and I want to address them directly. The people who made the decision to shelter in place during the weakening phase, people who looked at the updated forecast showing reduced intensity and decided that their home was adequate shelter for the storm that was being projected, need to reassess that decision immediately in light of the re-intensification. The logic that supported staying in place when the forecast was for a weaker storm does not automatically transfer to the re-intensified storm that is now being forecast. A decision that was reasonable yesterday based on yesterday's data is not necessarily reasonable today based on today's data. And the most dangerous cognitive trap in this situation is the one where people treat the decision they already made as fixed, as settled, as something that the new forecast information needs to overcome rather than simply inform. Your previous decision to stay was made with incomplete information. The information is now more complete. If you are in a surge zone, if you are in a mobile home or manufactured housing, if you are in a structure that was borderline adequate for the weakened storm, but is not adequate for the re-intensified one, the fact that you already decided to stay is not a reason to continue staying. It is a reason to make a new decision with the new information you now have. For those who can still evacuate, and the window for safe evacuation is narrowing with every advisory cycle but has not yet closed for all communities in all parts of the threat corridor, the guidance is unambiguous and urgent. Leave now. The roads that are open right now will not all be open in 6 hours. The fuel that is available right now will not all be available in 6 hours. The evacuation routes that are running at manageable traffic volumes right now will not all be running at manageable volumes in 6 hours. Every element of the evacuation infrastructure degrades as the storm approaches, and the storm is approaching faster now that the weakening phase is over and the forward motion has continued. The time advantage that felt available during the weakening phase, the sense that there was room to wait and watch and see how things developed, was a product of a forecast that has now been superseded. Act on the forecast that exists today, not the one that existed yesterday. For those who cannot evacuate and are sheltering in place, the preparation requirements are specific and non-negotiable. You need to be in the strongest interior room of the most structurally sound building available to you, on the highest floor that is above the projected surge inundation level for your location, before the outer bands begin to produce hazardous conditions. You need to have your emergency supplies, water, food, medications, communication devices, weather radio, consolidated and accessible in your shelter location. You need to know that once the storm's eye wall passes over your location, the calm of the eye is temporary, and the backside eye wall will arrive with full force, potentially from a different direction than the initial winds, and that the eye passage is not the end of the storm. People who have left shelter during the eye of a hurricane to assess damage or check on neighbors and been caught outside when the backside eye wall arrived are in every major hurricane fatality record. The eye is not safety. It is the halfway point of the most dangerous part of the storm. This storm took a strange turn. It weakened when the forecasters said it might weaken. It re-intensified when the forecasters hoped it would not. It demonstrated, in the most operationally consequential way possible, that the atmosphere does not owe anyone a favorable outcome, and that the window between a dangerous storm and a catastrophic one can open and close in ways that challenge even the most sophisticated forecasting systems in the world. The re-intensification is real. The updated intensity is real. The recalibrated surge, the expanded wind field, the elevated rainfall threat, all of it is real. All of it is in the official National Hurricane Center products. And all of it demands a response that matches the storm that actually exists right now rather than the storm that existed in yesterday's forecast. Stay with the National Hurricane Center. Follow your local emergency manager.